Good evening, everybody. It's time for the second first Monday of the season in our autumn full of French music. This program has three composers on it, and you might say when I tell you that they're not all three French, but I'll explain. The first composer is born in Finland. Her name is Kaija Saariaho. And the second one is Francis Poulenc. And the third one is Olivier Messiaen. The last two, you can tell from my hopefully decent accent, are French. And the first one, as I said, is not. But let me tell you about her. Kaija Saariaho was born in Helsinki, which is Finland, of course, in 1952. Finland has, ever since the time earlier of John Sibelius, has become such a center of vibrant, successful activity in music that it has brought us a great many wonderful performers, conductors, and she, among all of the composers, of which there are many, somehow or other has become the most famous of them all. She was born in Helsinki. Her first studies were at the Sibelius Academy and other places in Helsinki. And then she moved for a while to the German city of Freiburg, where she did further studies in composition, and also Darmstadt, which was a kind of a great center of the avant-garde in that period. After that, she went to the research center in Paris, run by Pierre Boulez, called IRCAM, I-R-C-A-M. So by then, in 1982, when she moved to Paris, essentially she never left. She met and married a Frenchman. They have French citizen children, and she still lives there. So since 1982, which is now 40 years, that's been her home. So I'm very happy to include her in our French series because she really is, in that sense, a French composer. The other sense in which she's a French composer is she's very interested in colors and sounds, and that seems to be a hallmark of the French school of art, going all the way back to the Impressionists. In her output, she's very famous for her operas and for many works with voice. At the same time, the other thing that seems to dominate her interest as a composer is she forms alliances and interests with performers. So she has very long-standing relationships with wonderful performers of our time. And as I read, she wrote in her website that music is not a working out of abstract processes, like, say, writing a fugue or doing something according to a particular structure, but, as she says, an urgent communication to the listener of ideas, images, and emotions. That seems very French to me, and I think that she is, among living composers, perhaps the greatest exponent of that attitude toward what the role of the composer is. This year is the year of her 70th birthday, and right now, October going into November, they're doing a huge celebration honoring her by having all kinds of her music played, and I think that her most recent opera, which is called Innocence, is getting its first performance in Finland because of that. And by the way, that opera, which I've not seen but tasted a little bit online, Innocence, such a hopeful word, is an opera about shootings in a school. I'm sorry to say it, but it's not a problem that's associated with any one place. But when I listen to it, I hear that she's interested in a very complex, wonderful way of capturing feelings and emotions and sharing them. So what about the program tonight? Well, we're doing a wonderful piece by her called Clouds. By the way, that's an English title that she gives to it. which is the same title that Debussy in 1899 gave to a work of his called Nuages. She says, "A string trio is a fascinating ensemble. Even if its instruments come from the same family, it magnifies the individual characters of each. When writing the trio, I was surprised how different it was to writing for a string quartet. Why Cloud Trio? Why Cloud? When composing this piece in the French Alps, watching the big sky above the mountains, I realized once again how rich a metaphor a natural element can be. Its state or shape is so recognizable, and yet it is always varied and rich in detail." So she takes those three instruments and she has all kinds of instrumental demands, some of which she's kind of invented. And with all of that complexity, still, she is conveying to us a picture of our world. And it's a wonderful piece, and I know you're going to enjoy it. The next composer that we're presenting tonight is the French composer Francis Poulenc. He was born in 1899, and he died in 1963, so he's essentially a 20th century composer. He was the only child of a very successful businessman. His father was deeply religious in the Catholic faith, and his mother was an arts lover. And that's a very, very comfortable background. He had a good piano teacher, and he was beginning to compose a little bit, and somehow or other, that seemed to be the way it should go. Now, it won't be unfamiliar to any of our conservatory students, or many of them, that very often parents worry about music. That's a tough profession. And they are kind of steered away from it or not encouraged in it. I would say that those of us who have become musicians have maybe, in my case, I had some of that sense from my father. But basically, we do it because, I'll put it this way, we don't choose music. Music chooses us. And we can't help do it because that's what's in us and we need to express it. In any case, his father was so worried about it that he forbade him from going to a music school, to a conservatoire. But somehow or other, he stuck to it and he found private teachers to help him and whatever. And his first successes were works that he wrote for himself as a pianist, and his early career, mostly he was considered a lightweight composer. He was very captivated by French popular society, by the jazz movement, by the music halls, and he really connected to that world. But at the same time, he was fascinated and interested in the music of Debussy and Stravinsky. Stravinsky was in France a great deal in that period of time. And he really found a beginning as a composer, but mostly in that, I would say, not serious music, lighthearted music. At one point, there was somebody, a journalist, I think, who said, well, there were 6 young French composers, and they were all rising in prominence. And so that journalist gave them a name and called them Les Six, which means the 6. He was one of them. Darius Milhaud was another one of them. Germaine Taillefer, the woman, and the Swiss one is Honegger. And what he commented on is, well, it's an accident of journalism that we're called Les Six because we're all so different from one another. And I think that's interesting. Anyway, when the First World War came, he was briefly in the army. And after that, he found a teacher for himself named Erik Satie. Erik Satie was a French composer who I would say was eccentric. There are a few works that He wrote, that are still known, 3 movements in the shape of a pear, or gymnopédie. It was very light kind of music. And yet, somehow or other, from around 1930 on, when so he was about 30 years old, he got more and more serious in what he was writing. And he began to write a lot of religious music. And all of his life, as that deepened, but he never left the lighthearted part of it behind him. There was this duality in Poulenc between the lighthearted, the popular, and the deeply religious music. Now, the work we're doing tonight is an unusual work. It's based upon a book called Babar the Elephant. And the story of why we have this work is really charming and interesting. There was a woman named Cécile de Bruynhoff. She and her husband, Jean de Bruynhoff, had 2 children. And around 1930, it seems like she was telling them bedside stories, and she created this story about an elephant born and who becomes eventually the king of the elephants. Her husband, Jean de Bruynhoff, was an illustrator, and he took that story from his wife, and he made a book of stories about Babar the elephant, which I think it's almost impossible in the 20th century for any young child not to have heard those stories, and they're very much loved. After that initial one, her husband wrote several more stories about Babar the elephant, but how does that have to do with Poulenc? Well, it seems that about 10 years later, around 1940, he was playing in the home of a young relative, and that young relative was listening to his music and didn't like it very much, and sort of told Poulenc, "I don't like your music." So it happened somehow or other, there was lying around a volume of Babar the elephant, and he put it on there, and he read her, this young person, a chapter out of Babar the elephant, and then started improvising. She loved it. It was really the beginning, 1940, when he began to think, oh, that's an interesting thing. And then, interestingly, as the Second World War finished, he had written a whole piece, which we're going to hear tonight, based upon the narration taken from the book and with his piano interludes enlarging on that. It's a charming piece. We have it narrated tonight by somebody who has done a lot of narration in her life, Paula Robeson. But of course, she's a famous flute player. But this appealed to her very much, and she's done it before. And I know that you're going to love this. One last thing I want to say about Poulenc is one of his latest great pieces, which was a masterpiece, was his opera called The Dialogue of the Carmelites. And it is one of the prime operas of that time that tells in very wonderful music and with very deep connection to his faith a story of something that happened during the French Revolution. But in the meantime, let's enjoy Babar. So we started our program with clouds in the Alps and gone to an elephant from Africa, lighthearted, written at the end of the Second World War. And we're moving to a very serious, great piece written by the French composer Olivier Messiaen. His years are 1908 to 1992. He's from the south of France. He was born in Avignon, in the Provence area, and his mother was a poet, and his father was a professor of English, who actually, his father translated many of the plays of Shakespeare into French. So he grew up in a cultural arts background. And in fact, during the First World War, they lived in the southern city of Grenoble. And during that time, Messiaen was very interested in Shakespeare because of the work of his father, and they would set up and do the plays at home as a way of occupying themselves. And later in his life, actually, he loved that area so much that that's where he lived most of the time in his life. But he went to the Paris Conservatory as a young man, and I think the only way I can tell you how his life was there is that he studied and mastered everything. His first topic, I think, was harmony. Then he had music history. Then he was a keyboard player. He started studying the organ, and he became very famous as an organist. And his first real professional activity was a church organist to one of the fine churches in Paris that had a great organ. And he did that all of his life, and he wrote a lot of music for organ. As a composer, he was very inventive with forms and structures. And one of the things that was interesting about him was that he had something that is called synesthesia, which means that when he heard music, it created images in colors in his mind. He had new ideas. He was breaking away from where he'd come from as a trained organist. He had new ideas about how to group notes as harmonies in very unusual ways and in rhythms in very unusual ways. I will say that he was, more than anything, he was a religious composer. He was of the same deep faith, and that was very much a driving force for him always. He was very interested, living in the countryside in the south of France, in the songs of birds. And he was more knowledgeable about bird song than many ornithologists because he was a musician. And he collected bird songs, and that actually plays into the piece we're hearing tonight a little bit, but also influenced his later compositions. So what about tonight's piece? Very, very strong name, Quartet for the End of Time. He was drafted into the French army at the time of the Second World War. And in 1940, almost immediately, when France capitulated to the Nazis, he was interred in what we would call, I guess you'd call it a concentration camp. It was not one of the death camps that we think about of Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. It was called Görlitz. And he was there, and I would say that life was pretty miserable. You know, there was no heat in the winter. They were not treated well. But somehow or other there, he became friendly with some of the guards, and there was an upright piano, and he found a few musicians, and he began to write a piece for them. And he found a violinist and a cellist and a clarinetist. And he was there only for 9 months, but during that time, he wrote this piece for them, and the actual first performance of it was held in the concentration camp in Görlitz for guards and prisoners. And it's called, as I said, Quartet for the End of Time. Now, you can take that a lot of ways, but actually on the title page it says in French, Un hommage à l'ange de la police qui lève la main vers le ciel en distant. Il n'y aura plus de temps. Time is over. Now, usually in the Catholic tradition, when the end of time is, we call the word the apocalypse. It's the time when everything stops on earth and there is no sense of what we call earthly time. But at the same time, there's the word again, he was beginning to think about how to use time in a very creative way. And in the score of this piece, he outlines his theories about time and his outlines about his theories about groupings of notes. And yet, if you listen to the piece, you're going to be impressed by the strangeness of it all, but also the deeply religious fervor of it. It's a long piece. It's 55 minutes long. And in that sense, time is kind of stopping too, because these pieces, some of them are either very energetic or very, very transfigurational. And one word right in the middle is called the abyss of the birds. There we are again with his interest in birds. That's for solo clarinet. Of the pieces, I think only 4 of the several movements are with all people playing. One of them is with cello and piano. One of them is clarinet alone. One of them is with violin and piano. And it's a deeply affecting piece. And I would say if you look back now on what this program is about, we've got a mixture of clouds, lightheartedness, by the way, written in 1945, just not long after the Quartet for the End of Time, and the very severe message of war and concentration camps. This is all French. This is all important to our world of the arts. And this is a program that gave me great pleasure in putting together with wonderful artists. And I know it's going to be a very special experience for you to listen to it.